right, we're back with Attack of the Yokai no Kogeki. Can you guys introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the project?
I'm Jason. I'm Will. So Yokai no Kogeki is a VR tower defense game, and we felt that the most important difference for our game in terms of tower defense is that it is a two-layered map. And so in most tower defense games, there's one map with different routes that enemies can go along. We implemented pits and ladders in order for enemies to go from one layer of the map to another layer and vice versa at certain points in the map in order to find different routes to the end point. And so that was one of the main unique parts to it, besides being VR, obviously.
That's cool. So do the units walking through find their own path through the environment, or do you route them into different paths, or?
Yeah, so they have preset paths, and at certain points they will split off, and they will randomly choose where they want to go.
Okay, but it is not free form like the earlier tower defenses. It's path structure based. Can you modify when things can go up or down between the two levels?
In what sense?
Can you remove a ladder or add a stair or those kinds of things?
So we have stages set in the game where they will appear. There won't be any in the beginning, and then at certain stages they will reappear after a certain amount of levels.
Oh, I gotcha. So you guys can as designers, but players can't affect it. Gotcha.
Okay, so in terms of game design, you took tower defense and you've identified the bi-level geography as your differentiation. What does that do for you? What does that do for me as the player? How does that feel different?
I mean, so the whole point of getting the two-level design was having a limited perspective. And so as being in VR, first of all, you only have a view of a third of the map. And so adding that second layer, essentially now you have 1/6 of the map that you can see at any one time. And so for the player itself, it's very...
you find yourself ducking down to kind of look around?
Well, you're turning around a lot,
Okay,
and so you're constantly turning around, switching between the maps, trying to get an idea of what's going on, where are enemies coming from, because later in the waves, their enemies are coming in from 4 different points, 2 in the upper map and 2 in the lower map. So it's hard for the players sometimes to get an understanding of where they're coming, but if they understand where they end up, that's where they start to understand and do well in the game.
So you just touched on this. What are some other challenges that you face bringing tower defense to VR?
So first of all, to talk about the art, I was the artist for the game. A lot of the models don't really look the same as they do inside of the regular Unity engine. So we had to make a couple of changes, as well as we had to make a custom shader to all the objects. If you can probably see in the trailer, there's a lot of dark outlines, and we originally had a pre-built shader that we just downloaded, and it didn't seem to work because when we did it in VR, it really messed with the way all the normal maps looked, and we couldn't apply anything.
Was it a post-effect shader over the whole scene for the outlines, or was this on the objects themselves?
It was on the objects themselves. We applied the shader to the objects themselves. It was like a toon shader, like a basic.
Oh, so it probably did some kind of inverse and push to kind of create.
It pushed a lot of weird stuff to the front, and it didn't look great at all. So we had to make our own.
Okay.
There was a lot of weird things that happened with particle systems as well. So we had to make a lot of changes to the way that things are scaled. So it makes it look like it looks normal to the player, but in reality it's right next to them. So the sun in the game is it looks like it's behind the mountains, but it's literally a meter away from the player itself because the particles didn't load from far away.
Oh, interesting.
In terms of I guess the technical sides, when we originally made the game, it was a 2D format. You played it on the computer, and so we had to basically alter that 2D version and create the VR version. We used a virtual reality toolkit in order to just get the interactions between the players and the actual game. And so basically you just use a laser pointer in order to either click on a spawner to place it down or upgrade towers or sell them, right?
So your view is, the first person view isn't as important here. It's more so the God's eye view of the scene that you're seeing things from?
Yeah, so basically you're put in the center of an area atop of a tower. So you are elevated up and you look down at your map and you're constantly turning around.
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the ones we couldn't demo earlier. So
Yeah, would be cool to see it.
We actually have it up now, so
Oh, yeah?
if you guys want to check it out afterwards.
Yeah, I will, definitely. Yeah, I love tower defense, and I am intrigued by the idea of a VR tower defense. It sounds like it could be silly, in like a good way.
Very silly.
So you described a couple of the technical limitations that you had to overcome, or the obstacles, shaders, particles, and so forth and so on. Can you talk a little bit about same for gameplay in VR? Because it's not a one-to-one mapping from regular flat screen to, right?
I didn't work on the tech, so.
Well, okay. Can you explain more what you mean?
Okay, look, you cannot roll people this way a bunch in VR, right? That's gameplay thing number one. And you already mentioned that in moving from flat to VR, you had to make some gameplay changes.
So in the 2D version, the basics of the game were there. So like the nodes where you place towers, the towers themselves, shooting at enemies moving. That was all there in the 2D version. The only differences that we had to do implementing the actual VR part of it was setting up the VR and then scaling all the objects so that it actually looks right in a sense. And
So
then
more
making
so
sure
from a setup standpoint, less from a compromising your gameplay vision standpoint.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier having trouble getting people to see where enemies were coming from. What was your solution to something like that?
Just see where enemies were coming from. Sorry, what was
With the bi-level?
Yeah.
Well, so one of our intended player experiences was that we wanted a limited player view of the map. So we didn't want them to see everything and know everything while they're playing the game. And so that was the reason why we wanted that. We only wanted them to see part of the map at a time.
So that's an actual design consideration. That's the kind of stuff we were after then, and that becomes the VR intrinsic gameplay. The fact that you don't have perfect knowledge, because most tower defenses you have perfect knowledge of what's going on at any one time, but here you don't. So does that make the game harder? Did you have to make the actual design easier? I mean, I would imagine it makes things harder. But
Yeah, so it definitely makes the game a lot harder. In the beginning of the game, they only come from one area, and it's very obvious where they come from. We also give a prompt when a new stage of the map gets unlocked, I guess you could say, and a new area for them to spawn comes out of, but it gets much more difficult than if you had the entire view of the map to see.
If you're constantly asking the player to spin around, kind of figure out where people are coming from, or where the enemies are coming from, do you have to design the art of the level around that very particularly so that they don't lose orientation? So okay, I know things are going to come from the north. Is north red? All the art is red over there. Along those kind of gimmick kind of solutions.
So we found that we didn't really have a lot of motion sickness issues, which a lot of other teams have when they're first doing VR. In terms of the art that we specifically made, we didn't really see any problem with the way that everything was laid out. It plays pretty well, and it doesn't destroy your brain when you play it for too long, which is great.
That's
for
good.
A VR game, yeah.
All right, so we have 30 seconds left. In those 30 seconds, as gamers, VR, AR, XR, or flat screen, what's the future?
I don't know what XR is, so I'm going to go with
Except for audio.
XR. I'll say VR just because, there's a lot of new stuff coming out with at least data visualizations too on VR, so I think that'll be pretty big.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.